Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 19. In this video, we're going to just go over how to compose an inharmonic modulation. And an inharmonic modulation, just to refresh your memory, is a modulation that involves inharmonic reinterpretation, where we're taking a chromatic chord that exists in one key, and we're reinterpreting it by, thinking about respelling the notes so it can resolve as it would in a new key. So modulation using inharmonic reinterpretation. So our objectives for this video are to explore the process of composing an inharmonic modulation, and we'll also talk about how to adjust that folk song accompaniment, so the texture that we called boom chick, right? How we could adjust that for other time signatures. So let's quickly review harmonization, because that's essentially what we're doing. Harmonization is the process of adding chords to a given melody, and the chords you pick should do three things. They should be consonant with the melody, or create a dissonance that is correctly resolved. That's really important with this texture. And the chords should result from good voice leading, particularly between the outer voices. So in this case, we'll have good voice leading between the bass note and our melody. And the chords, of course, have to create a logical harmonic progression. And in this case, they'll also have to connect that logical harmonic progression to a modulation. Okay, so let's review folk song, or otherwise known as boom chick style, right? So this texture consists of a single melody, right, on the top staff. Not every note gets a chord, right, so it has a different harmonic rhythm. A piano bass line, right, so that'll be the left hand of the piano note on the bottom staff. And then, of course, we have the chick part, where we have offbeat chords. And all the chords have to be playable, so they have to span an octave or less, so they fit into one hand. And they serve to complete the chord, and they should also avoid clashes with the melody, and they should also have good voice leading as best we can. Some of the things you want to remember is that there's a slower harmonic rhythm for this kind of texture, right? So in chorale texture, we were changing chords every note of the melody. Now we're changing chords maybe once or twice a measure, right? So we have less chords to pick, but that means we have to choose certain notes of the melody to be non-chord tones most of the time. And we want to try to have good voice leading with our right hand chords. Of course, you want to have good voice leading between the bass and the melody. That's your priority. But we should, as much as we can, have good voice leading in our right hand too. But sometimes you have to sacrifice the good voice leading in order to make something playable. Okay, so those are some things to remember. Now, boom chick refers to, of course, that we have a bass note and an off note chord. And that works great in a meter like 4/4. But we're going to try to harmonize something in 3/4. So what we're going to do is we're going to start to adapt this texture into different meters. So in 4/4, since the beats in 4/4 are strong, weak, that works out well for boom chick, boom chick. But if we have something like 3/4, okay, like this melody here, which we're going to harmonize, now the rhythm in 3/4 should go strong, weak, weak, strong, weak, weak. So the texture that should happen in 3/4 should reflect that meter. And so the ideal kind of texture that adapts boom chick would be boom chick chick, boom chick chick. Okay? However, that's not always going to be the case. So you can be a little bit more or a little bit less strict with your texture when you're using other meters. And in general too, in 4/4 you can change the texture as well. So now we're going to allow ourselves to break this boom chick texture when we need to. And you can kind of see in the second bar, we need to have a chord on that third beat. So we're not going to be able to just use a right-hand chord, maybe. So we might have to use a different texture there to break up the pattern of boom chick chick in this case. Okay, so let's get started with this. So first we're going to listen to this melody. And as we listen, we want to try to figure out how and to what key and where this modulates, because this is going to have an enharmonic modulation. Now, this is just a short little snippet of, a bigger piece, so it's not going to feel like it's super compelling because we're not going to spend a lot of time establishing G major. So it might feel a little abrupt, modulating to a different key, especially a chromatic one. So we just kind of have to imagine that this happens in the middle of a piece of music. Okay, so here's our melody. 3/4 starts in the key of G major. Okay, and you can see that it ends on an A flat. We also have a C natural in that third bar, and a B flat, and a G. So to me, this, if we had to figure out the key, which you do have to figure out in the assignment, the key kind of looks like we have, if we just listen to those last three notes, that clearly outlines, something that sounds like re, ti, do. So I think we can say that this modulates to the key of A flat, just based on the sound, right? That's a pretty common thing to happen there. We have re, ti, do. So let's say that this modulation is going to go from G major to the key of A flat. And so you'll see that I've given you the chord that's going to be the enharmonic pivot, right? The enharmonically reinterpreted chord. And you can see that it's identified in the old key of G major. So we will write A flat as our new key, just like we're doing for those common chord, those pivot chord modulations. Okay. We know, by the way, that it's A major because we have a C natural, not a C flat. Or sorry, A flat major because we have a C natural, not a C flat. Okay. So then, how would we enharmonically reinterpret a German augmented sixth chord in the key of A flat? Well, it takes some knowledge of how enharmonic reinterpretation works, but whenever we have a German augmented sixth, which sounds just like a major minor seventh chord, that can be reinterpreted in a new key as a dominant seventh chord, a 5/7 of some kind. Because remember, they have the same sonority, they have the same sound. So this German augmented sixth is going to be reinterpreted as some kind of 5/7 in our new key. Okay? And so what we could do is maybe we could write out, and maybe we could even use this in our harmonization, but we could write out what the notes would be for a German augmented sixth chord in the old key, and then see if we can figure out what that chord would be in our new key of A flat major. So we know that we need an augmented sixth, and the bass note of an augmented sixth chord goes down a half step to the fifth scale degree of the key that we're in. So if we're in the key of G major, the thing that's a half step above the fifth is going to be an E flat. So a good bass note here would be an E flat. Okay, and then it also has a third above the bass, and let's go ahead and just write that maybe in our right hand. Okay, it also has a fifth above the bass, so that's going to be a B flat. All right, and then it also needs something to make it an augmented sixth. And so something that leads up to the fifth scale degree. You can see that that exists in our melody here. We have a C sharp in the melody. Now, you could do this a couple different ways with your right hand chord. You could go ahead and double that if you wanted to. There's really no reason not to. But if you want to maybe make it sound a little bit more full, you could double that third above the bass, which would be a G. So let's go ahead and do that. So this fits within an octave. It's still playable, right? But we're not necessarily including all the notes that should go in that chord because we already have one of the notes that goes in that chord in the melody, so we don't need to double it. All right. So now you can see that this looks like an E flat, a G, a B flat, another G, and then the C sharp. So that's how you spell a German augmented sixth in the old key of G major. Well, let's see if we can reinterpret this as something that exists in the key of A flat major. Okay. So we know that this note C sharp doesn't exist in the key of either G major or our new key A flat. So somehow we have to figure out a way for this to exist in our new key. And so what you can do is you can go ahead and just kind of rewrite this. So C sharp can be rewritten as a D flat. They're the same pitch, they're just different notes. So C sharp and D flat are the same pitch. Okay? Which means that our chord now is E flat, G, B flat, and D flat, which is a 5/7 chord in our key of A flat major. So we reinterpret what was a German augmented sixth in the key of G as a 5/7 in the key of A flat. So that's our common chord, that's our pivot. All right, so we figured that out. And then of course, that would be followed by some other harmony, but this is going to be our inharmonic reinterpreted chord, our chromatic pivot chord that causes an inharmonic modulation. Okay, so that's a good place to start with the given chord and how we would reinterpret that in our new key. So all I did is just figure out what key we're going to by looking at the melody at the end of this, right? Looking at the given chord, the pivot chord, and seeing if we can respell some of the notes so that it exists in the key that we're going to, okay? Also, you have to be careful because sometimes maybe that it will be already respelled in the new key, right? So either option is on the table. So for accidentals and things, maybe even natural notes, you have to think about how, what the possibilities are, how they can be inharmonically respelled to work in whatever key you're going to, or maybe work in the old key as well. So that's the important thing. Now, of course, another way to think about it is that C sharp, right? The C sharp should have resolved up by step to the 5th scale degree, but that's not what happened. Instead, it worked inharmonically, right? It worked the way it should work in the key of A flat. So it resolved down by a step. And, sevenths, the seventh of the chord always resolves down by step. So it wasn't working as a, the top part of an augmented sixth. It was working as the top part of a seventh, moving down by step to the next note. So that's another way to think about it. Okay, let's take away all that stuff I wrote there. All right, so now we can just kind of go from there, work on our harmonization. So in this first measure, you want to look for things that cue you into something being a non-chord tone and things that determine if something is a chord tone. So here we have a G, an A, and a B. So if you consider this entire measure, right, we have two notes that belong in a G major chord, right? They could also belong in a E minor chord, but there's no E in that measure. So I think a safe pick for this would be a 1 chord, so G major harmony, and we're going to consider that A to not be in the chord. That A will be a passing tone between the G and the B. Okay? So to represent this, we could write in a bass note G. And, considering the shape of this melody, let's start on a higher bass note. So we'll write in the note G, and we'll call it a dotted half note. So it'll take up this entire measure. Now we want to adapt the texture for this, right? So normally that would have been a half note, but we're going to hold out that boom, the boom part, right? The bass note for the entire length of the measure. Okay, let's go ahead and look at the next measure and try to figure out a good bass note. Now, this is going to be a German augmented sixth, and a good chord to lead to a German augmented sixth is another predominant harmony. So that could be a 2, it could be a 4, anything like that. So why don't we use a 4/6, since we know that 4/6 leads nicely to German augmented sixth. So we'll put in a bass note E here, and we'll say that this is going to be a 4/6 chord. Okay, so now we have, I think, good contrary motion between our melody, because our melody goes upwards, and we're writing a bass line that goes downwards. So we're emphasizing contrary motion, good voice leading between the two parts. Right? And notice I'm going to go ahead and keep that bass note there. So before in the first measure, we put a dotted half note in that first measure. And you would expect that we would have another dotted half note here. But since I need to emphasize that there's a chord on that measure, we'll go ahead and just break the pattern, right? So we'll go ahead and just say that we're going to have not in a dotted half note E, but we'll go ahead and just put in a bass note for that quarter note at the end of the measure. Okay. Now, if we kept going, our next chord, right, should follow not a German augmented sixth, because that's what it was in the old key, but our next chord needs to follow a chord progression that can work from the 5-7. So 1 is a good thing to follow 5-7. And can 1 in the key of A flat harmonize with our C? It can, because the bass note would be A flat. And so you kind of have a choice here. We could maybe go down by a perfect fifth, even though that is similar motion. You could also go up to an A flat, but let's go ahead and just keep it like this. I think that'll be fine. Okay, so we'll go ahead and just go down to the A flat there. And now you could actually make that A flat into a half note if we wanted to. Okay. And then in our next chord, we have something that we have a B flat, which doesn't harmonize with the A flat, and a G, which doesn't harmonize with the A flat either. So in this case, we might want to think about maybe breaking that pattern again and choosing a different bass note, maybe not having a dotted half note on this measure, just so we can get a different chord to go with those two. So let's rethink what we did here. So since this is a third, right, thirds usually indicate some kind of chord, and we have a B flat and a G, which is part of a 5 chord. So we need to somehow get a 5 on this part of the measure. And so let's go ahead and just say maybe we'll put an E flat as our 5, and we'll keep it a half note for now. And then we have some motion upwards in the melody, so let's have some motion downwards to the A flat. So that works there. Make sure, of course, we need to make this an E flat. Okay. Now, before we had an A flat over here, which I think sounds a little bit awkward since that C sharp is resolving downward to a C natural. That resolution would sound something like this, which is okay, but we could maybe make this a little bit stronger if we have some other kind of motion, you know, to create some good counterpoint. So what I just played there was oblique motion by keeping this E flat in our bass, in which case this would become a 1-6-4 chord, which will follow a 5-7, and which is actually okay. So we have 5-7 to 1-6-4 to 5 again to 1. Now to simplify this, if you wanted to go back to that pattern, you could go back to what we had before, and let's just do that. So we'll make this a dotted half note E flat. And what we'll do is we'll change the chord between this. So this E flat will just imply that it's a 1-6-4, even though we won't be able to include the notes that should belong there because we'll have a rest there. So what we'll do is we'll make the 5 exist in our right hand chord. Okay. All right, good. Now we could, let's write in the right hand for the piano. So going back to our key of G major, we'll put a rest, because now we're going to go boom, chick, chick. 1, 2, 3. So maybe we can add a G here. G chord, so G, D, and B natural. Now there is a second against the right hand of the piano and the melody, but that's okay. It's really short, and you know, it's just a passing tone, so we'll barely notice it. And then we'll repeat our G chord. because we're going for 1, 2, 3 in this case. So that's what we'll do. And we should have a rest on this next chord. And then we'll put in a chord here that'll make this a 4/6 chord. And we want to have as smooth as possible motion in our right hand. So we could keep a G, and we could keep the note, we could move the D up to the E from the next chord, and then we could have our root here. So, you know, we're talking about making a smooth motion between this chord to this chord, even though there's a rest in between. And if we listen to it, you can see that all that happens is those bottom two notes move up by step to create, you know, oblique motion with that G at the top, which is a good counterpoint thing to do. Right? So that sounds perfectly fine to me. And then does that work with the chord that we wrote before? Kind of. So we, you know, this might be a case where it's better to not worry about the voice leading to make sure that we have a playable line. So what I don't like about this is that we have an E going to a B flat. That's the leap of a tritone. And a C going down to a G, which is a pretty big leap too. To make this smoother, one option actually might be to leave out the E here in this chord and just make this a C and G, a perfect fifth. And that's fine because we already have the third in our bass. So it already exists. We don't need to repeat it if we don't want to. And this makes this a little bit better voice leading. And if you think about it, you could say that this is good voice leading because the D and the B collapse into that C. And then when we play this next chord, the C moves down to the B flat, and it also leaps down to the G. So that's another okay thing. Okay. Again, so we have to kind of balance, you know, the good of the voice leading with the good of the piano playability. So whatever you'd like to do there, I think is fine. Now, once we get into our modulation, we'll have this E flat by itself. Then we want to have our 5 chord in the key of A flat. So we already have our E flat in the bass. We could keep the G from our previous chord. And we could keep the B flat from the previous chord. And we could make this into, if we want to, into a 7th chord to emphasize that we're in the new key. So let's go ahead and add that D flat into the chord too. So now this is a 5/7. Okay. And then we could repeat it there because that exists in the melody. Also, all those notes belong in that chord. And so on this last beat, we could add a rest and maybe resolve that G natural up to an A flat to emphasize the melody if we wanted to. We could also, that's probably fine, let's do that. So G could go up to A flat. And so notice I'm not worrying too much about the voice leading between, you know, the upper part of the piano and the melody itself, right? So that would technically be parallel unisons there. But since we're writing a piano accompaniment, it's not that big of a deal because we won't really hear it like that. We'll hear it as emphasizing what's happening in the melody. So this is where like orchestration and arrangement comes, you know, starts to conflict with our voice leading stuff, right? So since we're writing music for instruments and a voice, right, we're less concerned, we're still concerned about it, but we're less concerned with the internal voice leading, right? The voice leading between the outer voices, like the bass and the melody, still need to be good, but the inside voices, we can kind of, you know, we have some wiggle room with how they work. And so you want to make the best choices for the instrument and the overall sound that you want. Okay, so let's play the accompaniment for this. Okay, so very nice modulation. So just something to keep in mind is when we're, using this boom chick style, right, it can be adapted to fit other meters, and it can also be adapted to fit in chords that you need to fit in that would break the pattern. So now that we've kind of gotten used to it, we can, use it as a texture rather than, a prescribed thing that we always have to do. So in this case, I needed a chord to go on the third beat of the second measure, so I broke that pattern of, a sustained bass note for the whole measure. And we've adapted it to 3/4, right? So we still have chick, chick, right? 2, 3 to emphasize the meter. So now we're going to start experimenting with textures and stuff like that for the upcoming harmonizations. Okay. Well, great. Well, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about this, please let me know. And yeah, have a great day.